Why was Utah the last state to recognize Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a holiday? A couple of days ago, we celebrated MLK Day, a national holiday, and I hope everyone found an appropriate way to celebrate someone who, though quite human, is one of America's great heroes. I always recommend people to read his letter from Birmingham jail, written in 1963. It's a stirring indictment of moderation in the face of inequality, which is just as relevant today, if not more relevant today, as it was back in the 1960s. I'll link to it in the video description. I'm actually going to close this video with some extended quotes from it because I think his message is certainly needed in today's climate. But while MLK Day has been a national holiday since 1983, it's only been recognized as such by Utah since 2000. Indeed, Utah was the last state to sign on to MLK Day. And for the preceding decade before that, they had done what they saw as a compromise measure of just calling it Human Rights Day, which is basically the All Lives Matter version of MLK Day. And part of the state's reluctance to recognize MLK was influential LDS leaders who had denounced King decades before and in the ensuing decades as immoral, communist, and anti-American. However, it was due to the constant agitation by Utah's Black residents, including some notable Black Latter-day Saints, as well as some LDS leaders like Gordon B. Hinckley, who enabled this change in Utah finally coming in with the rest of the nation. Of course, Mormons were far from the only conservative group, or even the only conservative religious group, that denounced King. Despite his posthumous reappropriation as a colorblind moderate, most white Americans had believed during King's life that he was too divisive and too radical and was causing more harm than good to the society. So tracing Latter-day Saints' perceptions of Martin Luther King Jr. reveals a lot about evolving Mormon racial views during the post-World War II era. In this video, I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to touch on King's radical legacy and why so many white conservatives and moderates denounced him during his time. I'll then talk about how Latter-day Saint leaders fit within this larger story. And then I'll explain how a number of LDS authorities, especially Ezra Taft Benson, continued to denounce King after his death, and how the Mormon struggle with King's image reveals a lot about how Americans writ large, but Mormons in particular, wrestled with the civil rights legacy. And this includes the fight over MLK Day as a national and state holiday. And then I'll close by returning to King's own radical message and why it remains relevant today. But before I get into that, I do want to give a shout out to the wonderful scholarship that makes this type of survey possible. Jonathan Eig's biography of Martin Luther King Jr., King Alive, published a few years ago and won a lot of major awards, is a phenomenal read and quite long, so you have to buckle up. In terms of white Christianity responding to King, I really enjoyed Lerone Martin's The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, which captures this broader story of the creation of white Christian nationalism in response and often in exclusion to voices like King's. And the Mormon story is found in a fabulous article written by Matthew and Madison Harris titled The Last State to Honor MLK, Utah and the Quest for Racial Justice, which was published in Utah Historical Quarterly a few years ago. I'll link to all of these, but especially the Harris article in the video description. Harris, of course, you know from his other great and award-winning book like Second Class Saints, about how the LDS Church reckoned with race in the post-World War II era, so he's certainly one of the authorities on the topic. While I'm thrilled that MLK now has a near universal, though sadly not totally universal, positive reputation among Americans in the 21st century, part of that is because his own message has been sanitized and appropriated by more moderates and conservatives who otherwise would denounce his radical teachings. The only line that most Americans know, and the one most often trotted out on his holiday, is a plea that people be judged according to the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, and that definitely is a through line in his teachings. But even that quote is often taken out of context and lacks the overall vision in which King's message was understood. MLK MLK called for what we would call affirmative action, critical race theory, and DEI. He pointed out systematic problems that had cemented white supremacy in American society and required radical intervening solutions. Many mistake his call for non-violence as just pure tepid pacifism, or his focus on love as supporting, measly compromise. But he supported radical intervention. He aimed to make politicians and institutions uncomfortable. He expressed a sophisticated theory of protest in which radical action creates a sacred time in which many possible decisions that were previously impossible, these decisions, actions, and legislation would only become possible through radical force. And he became more divisive, not less, throughout his career. He became one of the first major figures to denounce the Vietnam War. He fought for social class solidarity and wealth redistribution. In fact, when he was killed in Memphis, he had traveled there in support of a sanitation workers' strike. And you can tell how radical he was perceived at the time by the response from white America. He was obviously detested in the South. That's taken for granted. But many moderates, even in the North, and even a lot of progressives, found him a nuisance. They believed in a more progressive theology, in slow but definitive change over time, whereas King believed that change only came through extreme agitation. Here, for instance, is a political cartoon depicting this anti-MLK hate, which you might notice is quite similar to today's focus on the destruction caused by protests and calling these agitators as a nuisance and a menace and a threat to society. And during his life, we have polling that shows that he was one of the most untrusted men in America due to his agitation. In 1963, only 4 in 10 Americans believed he was making a positive change, and that actually dropped to about a third a few years later. And by the time of his death, this was a racially divided position, whereas 83% of Black Americans viewed him making a positive change versus only 27% of white Americans. The most radical responses to King, of course, came from J. Edgar Hoover and white Christian congregations. Hoover argued that MLK was a tool of the communists, and while MLK certainly held deep criticisms of capitalism, and some of his associates had peripheral ties to the Communist Party, they were never as deep or as influential as was alleged in trying to cast him as this red communist tool. Hoover called him the, quote, most dangerous Negro in America, and the FBI wiretapped MLK and spied on him nearly everywhere he went. They even tried to blackmail him into committing suicide at one point. And it's a good reminder that even though King was certainly a flawed human, and we could get into some of the troubles he had, a lot of the stories of the more severe issues that you might hear about King were actually part of this FBI propaganda mission and should be treated as such. Further, churches worked to denounce King as a heretic. They had always critiqued the Black religious tradition, which they saw outside of professional or acceptable Christianity, and white churches, North and South, were dedicated to supporting the status quo, which King, of course, was hoping to overturn, with, of course, notable exceptions of the many religious groups who tried to join in with King on the fight for equal justice. And those same forces that were shaping these different churches and politicians and Americans and how they reacted to King were also shaping Mormons in the mid-20th century. Before I go any further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this type of nerdy content, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you want to give back, you can become a member. And I'm so very grateful for the many of you who do the small monthly token payment that gives you early access to the videos, as well as icons next to your name. But most importantly, support me and my producer, Anthony, in putting in our time. We are so grateful that we're nearing 12,000 subscribers, which I thought unfathomable. You've heard my voice. You see my face. I didn't think that was possible. And we also recently passed 1 million total views, which is absolutely phenomenal. And to celebrate that, I'm traveling out to Utah for an awards banquet with the Utah Historical Society, and I'm doing a signing and a meet and greet at Benchmark Books on Tuesday, January 27th from 5 to 6 p.m. at Benchmark Books in Salt Lake City, and I hope to see many of you there. And if you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, make sure to subscribe for my free Kit newsletter. You can find a link in the video description so you can know all my different videos on different platforms, interviews and events, and all that good stuff. All right, let's get back to the history. The Latter-day Saints, as a community, predominantly in the Mountain West, started to move rightward in the mid-20th century, a trend that I've discussed in previous videos. This was in part over broader cultural trends related to gender and economics and rooted in the Cold War era, but it was also connected to and driven by their reaction to the civil rights movement. In fact, much of the Mormon political mind follows the same trajectory of the American South as they follow along with what the Republican Party had envisioned as the Southern strategy. Now, there were plenty of Black residents of Utah, including some Black members of the LDS Church, who tried to pressure the church not to take that direction. The NAACP in Utah were putting lots of pressure on the LDS Church in the 1960s. They threatened to boycott the 1963 General Conference and only avoided it when Hugh B. Brown, a member of the First Presidency, struck a compromise where he read a First Presidency statement in support of civil rights from the General Conference pulpit. But there were other prominent LDS leaders who were very vehement and clear and explicit in denouncing these civil rights protests and the broader civil rights movement. And one of the foremost figures, of course, was Ezra Taft Benson, who was an apostle in the LDS Church, was ordained an apostle in the 1940s, served in Dwight Eisenhower's presidential cabinet in the 1950s as the Secretary of Agriculture, and then after his term in Washington, became more radicalized through his association with the John Birch Society, a radical anti-communist right-wing movement, as well as his support of the policies of J. Edgar Hoover, who I mentioned earlier. He would deliver general conference and public addresses that claimed that MLK was a pawn of communism and the civil rights was a dangerous anti-American movement. And then at one point, he became so heated and so controversial that LDS leaders thought, well, maybe we can cool him down and send him on a mission to Europe, where he actually got in a bit of trouble on Europe, topic for another video, not like scandal trouble, but like due to his rhetoric trouble. And then when he returned, this was in one of his first homecoming addresses. Quote, "Before I left for Europe, I warned how the communists were using the civil rights movement to promote revolution and eventually take over the country. When are we going to wake up?" Imagine a Latter-day Saint leader saying this to the congregation, this deep skepticism about both MLK and the broader civil rights movement he represented. And Benson only increased his rhetoric as the Black rights movement became more radical during the 1960s when they were pushing for more change, when a lot of the progress had been stalled. He denounced MLK explicitly in a BYU address in 1966, and then again in a General Conference address in 1967. He also wrote the foreword for one of the most racist anti-civil rights tracts from the era, the book The Black Hammer. You see there an introduction written by the Honorable Ezra Taft Benson, though I promise you the remarks weren't very honorable. Benson wasn't alone. You had other figures like Cleon Skousen who were preaching similar anti-civil rights rhetoric, but let me focus on one other apostle, Mark E. Petersen, who viewed the civil rights movement in much the same way as Benson. In fact, during the 1960s, he became a bit uncomfortable when one Latter-day Saint prominent politician, George Romney, who was the governor of Michigan and was rumored to be a potential presidential candidate, a leading presidential candidate. John F. Kennedy once said that George Romney was the only potential opponent that he feared. And George Romney, one of the reasons why he was beloved in Michigan and nationwide, was that he offered this moderate support for the civil rights movement, even marching with the civil rights protesters. Petersen was worried, though, so he wrote Romney a long letter, I'll link to the letter in the video description, in which he claimed that Joseph Smith taught that segregation should be the law of the land. Anyone who went against this was going to face severe consequences. So, and I quote, here's a block quote. When I reflect on the prophet's statements and remember what happened to the three of our nation's presidents who were very active in the Negro cause, I am sobered by the demise, a reference to Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, and John F. Kennedy. They went contrary to the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, unwittingly, no doubt, but nevertheless the prophecy of Joseph Smith, those who are determined to pursue a course which shows an opposition and a feverish restlessness against the decrees of the Lord will learn, when perhaps it is too late for their own good, that God can do his own work without the aid of those who are not dictated by his counsel, and has and will continue to be fulfilled. Now, there were others, and I know you might want to take a moment to pause after reading that letter. Now, there were others like Hugh B. Brown in the First Presidency who tried to soften this rhetoric and tried to push back and show Latter-day Saint support for civil rights, and I could point to a few other examples. And starting in 1969, LDS Church leaders tried to rein Benson in, recognizing that he was a PR liability in speaking out on these issues. And yet Utah's opinions would long be framed around the influence of people like Benson, and so the legacies are going to last for quite a while. Of course, debates over MLK's legacy lasted long after his death. When MLK died by an assassin's bullet, it was a divisive moment in America. Some white progressives joined Black Americans in denouncing the violence and calling MLK a martyr, yet other conservatives said that King likely got what he deserved. Stapley probably believed that it was further confirmation of the prophecy he had outlined to George Romney. Benson was especially worried that in death, MLK might be seen as this heroic figure worthy of adoration. And so he wrote a memo to share with other general authorities to make sure they weren't going to give into this communist playbook. And he also wrote a sermon, later published as a pamphlet, Civil Rights, Tool of the Communist Deception, in which he emphasized that MLK was not a man to be seen as a hero or be celebrated. The New Yorker, the national magazine, even marveled about how this pamphlet was published and distributed at BYU and shaped Latter-day Saint thought. That sermon was later followed in a bigger book that Benson published, An Enemy Hath Done This, extending his argument over, MLK's legacy. And even after Benson was forced to moderate from LDS leaders, Cleon Skousen and other LDS public figures continued to spread the message, especially through Skousen's Freeman's Institute, an organization that Skousen founded in the 1970s and would become quite crucial and influential in shaping both Utah political thought and eventually American political and constitutional thought. One of the most important issues at the heart of this debate, of course, was MLK Day. Almost immediately after King died, many argued that we should have a national holiday celebrating the cause that he fought for. And over the next few decades, several states adopted MLK Day as a state holiday. And it was only after decades of agitation that Ronald Reagan, who had deep reservations about King as a Republican and conservative, begrudgingly signed legislation in 1983 to make Martin Luther King Jr. Day a national holiday. And almost immediately, 17 more states followed suit. Only a few states in the 1980s did not get along, and one of those, and the one that lasted longest, was Utah. So let's talk about that Utah rejection. Terry Lee Williams, the first Black Utahn to serve as a senator within the state, tried to press the issue within the state, showing that, look, the broader nation, including conservative states, including Ronald Reagan, are now celebrating MLK. Why can't we do it as well? And so in 1986, after several failed attempts, he was able to bring his legislation to a vote. Some groups, including the NAACP, also continued to push for its passage. Notably, by 1986, Ezra Taft Benson, here's an older picture of Benson, was the Latter-day Saint president. He chose to remain silent. We don't know if he did any backroom dealings, but it's likely he didn't have to because his words were already on the record. And there are many who opposed MLK Day, who cited Ezra Taft Benson as an example of, look, he is a leader of the LDS tradition. Utah is predominantly Mormon. We should not be celebrating someone who he has denounced. They also trotted out other lame excuses like, well, we can't afford to have another holiday, yada, yada, yada. Eventually, the bill fails in the Senate, where Williams had pushed it, but it does pass in the House, and then is brought to the Senate. And Williams, in trying to push the bill across the finish line, even brought out Coretta Scott King, MLK's widow. But in the end, the legislature, recognizing that, no, we're not going to celebrate MLK, they watered it down to just the Human Rights Day. Again, the All Lives Matter version of this holiday. But the Mormon politics don't only play in Utah. Down in Arizona, where they had just elected Governor Evan Meacham, who was a John Birch adjacent Latter-day Saint who loved Ezra Taft Benson and who had also frequently participated in Cleon Skousen's Freeman's Institute. By the way, the Freeman's Institute continued to publish editorials emphasizing why MLK Day was a bad day. After Meacham was inaugurated, an inauguration, by the way, that Benson attended, and there are rumors that Benson also blessed Meacham in the Mesa Temple for his position. Meacham then pushed forward and rescinded the state's MLK Day, which drew lots of ire. Now, that wasn't the only thing that drew lots of ire in Arizona. Meacham got in trouble with lots of measures, and in the next year, he ended up being impeached, the first, and I think at this time, the only Arizona governor ever to be impeached. So Arizona then walks it back and reinstates MLK Day. And within a decade, by the end of the 20th century, Utah remains the only major holdout not celebrating MLK. Luckily, by the year 2000, Utah was starting to fold. The biggest heroes in the story, of course, are the Black residents of Utah who continued to hold their legislators' feet to the fire, agitating that we don't need this stain on our reputation, and we should recognize the true valor that MLK represents and the principles that we share. Among those who pushed for this reassessment was the local NAACP president, Janetta Williams, who kept the fight ongoing and worked to coordinate with the LDS Church leaders, especially since Ezra Taft Benson had died in 1994, which enabled these circumstances to change. Howard W. Hunter served as president for a short while, and then Gordon B. Hinckley became the LDS president in 1995, who was much more PR conscious and much more willing to work with these groups that Benson had previously denounced. Benson, by the way, had often vehemently denounced the NAACP. Hinckley was orchestrating a kinder relationship with them. In fact, Hinckley accepted an invitation from the NAACP to speak at their conference in 1998, a watershed moment in the relationship between these two organizations, and something that Benson would never have considered during his lifetime. And when Janetta Williams approached the First Presidency about supporting the renewed bill to recognize the MLK holiday, James Faust, who was a counselor in the First Presidency, said that the First Presidency couldn't come out publicly to support, but they would encourage the Deseret News and KSL and their other media outlets to run positive coverage, which was a big change from a decade before. And then Hinckley also instructed the church's lobbyists to change their position on the issue. So in January of 2000, Representative Dwayne Bordeaux, an African-American rep from Salt Lake City, and Pete Suazo, the senator, a Hispanic-American senator, also from Salt Lake City, sponsored legislation. It failed the first Senate committee vote, but then was reversed and eventually passed by a majority of votes in both the Senate and the House, and was signed by Governor Michael Leavitt in March 2000, finally bringing Utah in line with the rest of the nation in recognizing MLK. I feel it's appropriate, and perhaps even necessary, to close this video with Martin Luther King Jr.'s own words, so that we don't just get caught up over how white voices divided his legacy, but talk about and foreground his legacy itself, because we need his vision of love and justice today just as ever, especially as we see the guardrails that he himself sought to establish in the nation now crumbling, and his vision of radical action through love being replaced by explicit white supremacy and cowardly concessions. So these quotes come from his letter from Birmingham jail, which I strongly recommend you going to read in full, which again, I have a link to it in the video description. I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises Negroes to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from the people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Then later on in the letter, there was a time when the church was very powerful. In the time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on, in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. By their effort and example, they brought an end to the ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests. Things are different now. So often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent, and often even vocal, sanction of things as they are. And then one final short passage that really struck home for me. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. I don't think I could have said it better myself. I mean, I'm sure I could never have said it better than that. I hope you found this video useful. If so, like and share so we can broaden the conversation. And I strongly recommend going to read Matthew and Madison's article on this topic because it has lots of more details that I couldn't fit in here. Now, I want to again close by emphasizing that it's easy to focus on the backwards and dangerous ideas of Benson, Petersen, and Skousen, but it's also important to recognize the other LDS leaders who pushed for change and saw the needed shift to come. And we should finally focus on the determination and bravery of the Black Utahns, including Black Mormons, who did not take no for an answer, who were motivated by MLK's powerful message and mission. So I hope we can all learn from this past episode, which is just another reminder of why history has never been more relevant than it is right now, and MLK's vision reminds us of that.